Good afternoon. In a short while from now, a new government and a new finance minister, Mr. P. Chidambaram, will announce the budget for 1996. It's a very special budget in many ways. The world's eyes are focused on India this afternoon because after 5 years of Manmohanomics, this is the first major policy statement of a new coalition government. And everyone wants to know if the policies of economic reforms will continue, slow down, or be reversed. In this program today, between now and 11 o'clock at night, we hope to bring you a more comprehensive understanding of the budget than ever before. In a short while from now, we shall bring you the budget speech live from Parliament. After that, this is the only place you'll get immediate reactions from the Prime Minister, the leaders of the opposition, and experts from around the country. We'll be checking up with the stock exchange to see whether share prices have gone up or down. We'll be talking to the Governor of the Reserve Bank live in Bombay. And of course, we'll have the man of the moment, the Finance Minister, in here to answer questions from 9:30 to about 11 o'clock tonight. He'll be answering questions from India and around the world. But now, over the next 25 minutes, I have a panel of the best possible minds to lead us up to this budget speech. They'll be telling us, I hope, what to look out for and what's good news and what's likely to be bad news for each one of us. Leading the pack is, of course, the one and only T.N. Nainan, who's not just the editor of the Business Standard, but the star of our budget show year after year. He's generally known as the guru of the financial community. Welcome, Nainan. And with him is perhaps one of the best-known faces around the world from the Indian business community, Tarun Das, Director General of CII, who's also a veteran of the budget program. And there's no better person to give us the pulse of the business community. Welcome, Tarun, once again. And to give us real insights into economic aspects of the budget is Rakesh Mohan, who's now a much freer man as head of the National Council for Applied Economic Research. He's reported to get to those parts of the budgets where others just don't reach. Welcome, Rakesh. Just quickly, Nainan, what would you like to see and what do you really expect to see in this budget?
Well, the two things one should look for, Pranay. One is that fiscal consolidation will continue, which means that you keep controlling the deficit and bringing it down. And the second is that you continue with tax reform and the reform program on a much broader plane.
This is what you'd like or would you expect?
Well, that's what I would like, and I would also expect to see all those happening in this budget.
I think you have the political will to do that?
I think the finance minister is very clear that he wants to do something significant and he wants the budget to make a statement about his government and about the policies the government will follow. So I would look forward with a great deal of expectation to the budget.
Tarun, is business worried about what's going to happen in this budget or optimistic?
No, we are confident and we've been continuously confident that the growth which we saw back into the economy with Dr. Manmohan Singh's budget of 94 will be sustained and will be in fact accelerated with this budget. So I think we see one process in the budget which is to stimulate and continue to stimulate growth, which means more revenue, more jobs, etc., etc.
But isn't it, that's what you hope, but isn't a coalition government has to balance so many different forces?
I don't see a conflict.
Decisive?
No, Pranay, I don't see a conflict in that. And I think over the last few years, we've also seen a delinking of a lot of the economic issues from political issues. And we see a broad consensus there on many issues. So even with the United Front government reading their the camp document, as we call the document which they brought out, I think there is a lot there for growth. At the same time, we're going to see more expenditure on social side, primary education, primary health, but also if I can echo what Nainan said, a process of cutting back government expenditure, a higher productivity of expenditure.
Do you think, in a word, will corporate tax go up or down in this budget?
Down.
Will go down. We'll see. Okay. Rakesh, more spending on the social sector, is that dangerous? Is that wasteful given the infrastructure, or is it necessary and will it happen?
I think that more spending on the social sectors is absolutely essential, because we can't really have growth in the long term unless we really spend much more on education, nutrition and health. So I would regard that as absolutely essential for the medium and long term. I would say that the real challenge before this finance minister is in improving the record of his predecessor. That is, in the 1980s, we were able to get 5.5% GNP growth for almost 10 years. From 92 to 96, as the recently released economic survey has shown, we've reached almost 6% average. But the challenge before this finance minister really is to manage the economy or guide the economy for the future, so that we can really approach 7% average growth for the next 5 years and 8% for the following 5 years. That's his real challenge.
And he's got a tough act to follow.
He's got absolute.
And of course, he doesn't have the advantage which Dr. Manmohan Singh did have, start with a crisis. That's always an advantage.
Well,
there's an excuse to do anything.
Yes, that's an advantage to do sort of very radical policy measures. But on the other hand, he has inherited an economy in good condition with the 7% growth rate in the last year. His real problem, of course, is to, if we are to sustain this growth rate even in this year, that is 96, 97, and in 97, 98, is whether he can remove the infrastructure constraints that I would say will be very serious, particularly in the power sector, in the next 2 years.
Yeah,
if he can't do that,
you've just done a large study on the infrastructure. We must focus on that a little in a few minutes. But just to start off with what you were talking about, the fiscal deficit. Perhaps one of the biggest concerns in today's budgets is the size of the budget deficit. But why is everybody always so worried about the deficit? Basically because it directly affects inflation. The fiscal deficit leads to a growth in what economists call high-powered money, or put it simply in our terms, cash. And then these economists apply the money multiplier to this to get the real impact on money supply. And as money supply grows, this causes inflation. So in a nutshell, fiscal deficits lead to inflation. That's why people worry about them. So what will the size of the deficit be this year? And will it lead to inflation? In the Manmohan years between 1992 and 96, the deficit was a high 6.2% of GDP. But even though this was high, it was much better than for the average 5 years before Manmohan Singh. Between 87 and 91, the deficit was out of control at 8.2% of GDP. The question is, what will Chidambaram bring it down to? Here's a basic thumb rule to look out for in this budget speech. If the deficit is around 66,000 crores, it will still be about 6% of GDP. If Mr. Chidambaram brings it down to about 5% of GDP, the deficit will be about 55,000 crores. And if it comes down sharply to 4%, the deficit will be about 44,000 crores of rupees. These are very broad numbers. Now, Nainan, will he be able to bring it down to 4%? That means there will be no giveaways.
Well, Pranay, the common minimum program that the government announced a few weeks ago did talk about bringing the fiscal deficit down to below 4%. But I cannot believe that that would be attempted in this one budget. I don't think it's possible to do that. If the finance minister controls it to within 5% this year, he'll be doing very well for two reasons. Number one, he will have to announce substantial increases in social sector outlays, because that is one of the focus areas of this government. And two, he may have to be announcing a lot of giveaways to state governments because they are talking about fiscal federalism being one of the things that they're going to try and do. So within those parameters, if he can keep the fiscal deficit to within 5%, I think he'll be doing very well.
Yeah. Tell me, how important is the budget losing a bit of significance because state governments are becoming much more important now? Is the central government budget?
No, not yet, because there's too much which determines economic growth or lack of growth around the budget, whether it is the direct taxes, the indirect taxes, the reality as well as the psychology. So the deregulation process continues, the states are becoming more important, but the central budget is still the kind of flagship economic event of the year.
And do you think, now coming back to the deficit in the center, do you think he will take radical measures to try and bring it down?
I don't think he can take very radical measures, but I think he can take innovative measures, creative measures. And I think I have this confidence that we will see some new initiatives to start the process once again, which started in 91.
Like one new initiative, I mean, for example?
I mean, if you take a lot of the projects which have been subject to cost and time overruns, I'm sure there's a very hard look being taken at those projects and whether they need to be continued, whether some of them can be dismantled or cut short, so that there is a saving into the budget. I think the one single point we will definitely see, and it's very critical for the economy, as you said, is to bring government borrowing down, which means to bring government expenditure down.
Coming back to the point you raised about infrastructure, if you're going to bring government expenditure down, should part of it come out of infrastructure? Should that be transferred to the private sector, or should they be spending more on infrastructure?
I'd like to make a couple of points here. First, that one of the very interesting things that comes out of the recent budgets, and one can take the interim budget of February as a guide, that out of something like 50,000 crore plan expenditure, only about 18,000 crore of that is classified as capital expenditure. What that really means is that in the last 10 to 20 years, what has happened is that we have done more and more what I would characterize as handout programs from the plan. One of the things that you could really be doing in terms of transferring many of those resources to basic infrastructure, basic roads and things of that kind, within the same amount of money. Because those programs will also really generate jobs all around the country, and so they would really serve the same purpose as many of the handout programs. That's the first point. The second is that the requirements of infrastructure are such that there is no question of substitution of private sector with public sector. In fact, if anything, the public sector has to spend more in terms of proportion of GDP. It has been spending something like a little over 4.5% or so of GDP on infrastructure. That possibly has to go to 5%. But what is important, of course, is at the same time to change the regulatory framework such and actions in the capital market so that the private sector brings in additional money, additional resources for infrastructure.
But what about the actual management of these infrastructure projects? It's so slow, there are overruns in almost every project. And we keep saying year after year, we must improve the efficiency, we must change this, but it just never happens. So isn't there something revolutionary that has to be done? Otherwise,
yes, I think that the government should bring to the attention of the nation the real difficulty that exists in the infrastructure sector. But one thing I would say is there has been slow improvement, even say in the power sector in the last 5 years. That the PLF, the plant load factor, has gone up from something like 55% to something like 60% on average in the last 5 years, and that's not bad. It may be the case that without doing...
we still get power cuts.
We all still get power cuts because demand is increasing much further, and what we had thought will come from private sector hasn't come because the government has been very, very slow in approving power projects. Yeah. So what I was going to say is really that the government must bring to the attention of the nation the really dire power situation that exists for the next 2 years, and unless power projects, both in the public sector and the private sector, are approved on a crash basis, and if the government must have a crash program to doing this, otherwise the other kind of growth that we are seeing, the effervescent growth that we are seeing from Tarun's friends in industry, we won't get that unless we really have a crash program for improving the power situation. That would be number one on our priority list.
Yeah, Nayan, now everybody knows this. Everybody suffers power cuts after nearly 50 years of independence. Why is it so slow? And how does one rectify the situation?
Well, Pranay, part of the reason is that the government has not had the money. You've been trying to control the deficits and they've cut back on investment. If the fiscal situation is brought under control, then you have more money to invest. And I think this government has already done a couple of things which help the budget. There is an expenditure policy which looks very sharply at ways of cutting expenditure and raising revenue at the same time.
Will anything really come of that?
I would think so.
Yeah?
On some of those things, definitely you will see some action. You also have a disinvestment commission which the cabinet has approved. And if you see that taking place quickly, then you will see some money coming into the government. I think you will see some initiatives in this budget which take the process further. There is some talk of zero-based budgeting, of transferring several programs to state governments. All this will clean up government finances in a way over a period of time. And then the government hopefully will have the money to invest more than they have had in the past.
Tarun, has the whole process of privatization of power been a very frustrating exercise?
Small beginnings have been made in some states, and Orissa is a classic example. You know, Pranay, the issue is to create an environment where the public sector can perform. And the public sector has not been able to perform, largely not because of the people. The people are the same and they're very capable people in the public sector, but because of the whole environment which doesn't give them operating freedom to take decisions. Okay. So we've got to get the private sector, public sector out from government's clutches, and corporatization, setting up corporations, commercialization would be a way.
Right. We'll be back with more analysis and insight on what to expect in this year's budget. Join us in a few minutes. Welcome back. There's still a little while to go before we go to the Lok Sabha for the budget speech live. At this moment, the cabinet is locked up in Parliament and is getting their first real look at the 1996 budget. After they've seen it, the finance minister will walk into the Lok Sabha and begin his speech. Let's see what Nainan thinks is going to be in that speech on taxes, personal taxes and corporate taxes. Are they likely to go down? No chance.
No, frankly, I don't know what will happen on personal taxes. He may or may not give some relief to individual taxpayers. But there's been a lot of speculation that what are known as the zero tax companies, companies which make substantial profits and yet don't pay any tax on those profits. And one bit of analysis showed that out of all the companies that are listed on the Bombay Stock Exchange, there are over 1,000 which pay no corporate tax at all. Oh, yes. So there's a lot of speculation that the ministry now wants to make sure that all companies pay a minimum amount of tax.
Tarun, no, some people don't pay any tax. Isn't that a disgrace?
No, it's not a disgrace, because it is part and parcel of the tax law and the tax policy. The tax policy provides for
surely not
plowing
in spirit.
back.
I mean, no tax.
Well, it provides for plowing back money into investment, and that's what companies who are not paying tax.
You did give a wry smile when you answered that question. I mean, it must be a worry.
I have to smile. I have to always smile when I'm with you.
When there's zero tax, but do you expect that to be stopped now?
As Nainan said, I think there is a great deal of speculation about it. I think the finance minister will have to balance the question of investment, which leads to longer term growth, with removing of the zero tax facility which is there. But there is some expectation that there will be some new initiative in that area.
Rakesh, on personal taxes, which a lot of people want to know, are salaried people, are they going to get a better break this time? I mean, prices have been shooting up.
Well, I think here I have to echo Nainan and say that one doesn't really have a good sense of what he might do on personal tax.
Would you like to see it gone?
I think that the time has now come that we should stop raising the exemption limit, because what we really want in this country is many, many more people in the tax net, along of course with Tarun's zero tax companies, because it is, I agree with you, it is a disgrace that as many as 1,000 companies don't pay any tax. I mean, how can you expect a salaried person to be paying tax happily when a large company does not pay any tax? But I would add there that the problem there is that there ought to be a little more unification between how the tax code treats companies' accounts and the company law accounts. Because the problem is only rising because under the company law you show certain profit, but in the tax code you don't have a profit because of the kind of provisions that Tarun has mentioned. Yes. The solution there really is not so much as taxing zero tax companies, but bringing those two provisions somewhat, making them somewhat similar.
Some uniform system.
Yes, so that you don't have this anomaly.
But when you say they shouldn't raise the exemption limit, do you think they should lower the rates of personal tax?
No, I think the rates now are quite fair. If you look at internationally, a maximum rate of 40% is, I think, quite a fair rate. One could argue that perhaps at the bottom you might bring that down from the minimum 20 that exists at present, so that when people just get into the tax net, they only pay 10% or something to get used to paying taxes. One point
before you get into that, there has been, of course, major changes in the way government has raised taxes in every budget. Taxes have, of course, been raised every year, as we well know, but the type of tax revenues have changed radically. 5 years ago, only 20% of tax revenues came from income taxes, that's both personal and corporate company taxes. The other 80% of tax came from customs and excise duties. But now things have changed. The share of income tax has gone up enormously. It's now 30% instead of 20%. And when a share goes up, that's a lot. And tax revenues through customs and excise is down to 70%. In fact, these changes in shares are very significant. So what are the basic tax problems that the finance minister will face in this afternoon's budget? Firstly, hardly anyone pays taxes in India. Out of a population of 900 million, there are only 10 million taxpayers. Even worse, more than 1,000 large companies do not pay any tax at all, as we've just discussed. And finally, the entire agricultural sector, that's 70% of the population, still does not pay any tax. But is agricultural tax, Rakesh, a bit of a red herring, or do you think they should be taxed?
No, I think it is a bit of a red herring because, as you know, the share of agriculture national income has now come somewhat below 30%.
So
And
even though 70% of the people, they only
That's right.
produce 30% of
That's
the
right.
income of the
That's
country.
right. And of course, from that, the number of rich farmers would be small. So it would be a waste of effort trying to tax them. What obviously you do need to do is to price the inputs, that is irrigation, power, fertilizer, more sensibly, so that you get those kind of resources
You mean raise
from the
those
rich
prices?
farmers. That is right. So that the rich farmers who you otherwise might want to tax, you actually get them to pay for the inputs they are using.
Do you think
One point, Prannoy,
sorry,
that,
carry on.
one point, Prannoy, that you mentioned about the share of the income tax going up.
Yes.
That's correct. But even now, the total corporation tax plus income tax put together still only amounts to about 3% of national income. That incidentally is about the same as it was in the early 1960s. And given that the non-agricultural economy has grown from say 50% to 70% now,
It
it is
should have
clearly
gone
the
up.
case
Yes.
that even people perhaps who were paying taxes in the early 60s are still not paying them despite the improvement in the last 5 years.
Nani, do you think agriculture tax is a waste of, there's been a lot of talk that some tax should be imposed, income tax on agriculture.
Well, Prannoy, the first thing is that agricultural tax is a state subject. The centre cannot tax agriculture. And two, I would share the
Even
view that
income
Rakesh-
tax, they can't touch
No, they
income
can't.
tax
It's
of
a state
farmers?
subject. It's a state subject. And two, I would agree with Rakesh that even if you were to tax it, I doubt if you will actually get very much tax income, because one, escaping tax when you're doing farming is much easier. You know, it's very much more difficult to get proper accounting done to see what the actual income is. And you will cause so much harassment and resentment across the countryside with taxpayers going after farmers. I really don't think it's worth the candle. And I would also agree with him that you should price the agricultural inputs properly so that you're extracting those subsidies away from the rich farmers.
Reduce the subsidies.
That's what one should do.
Just coming back to that zero tax, because it does seem a big worry for a lot of us who pay taxes. I'm sure you
But
pay
it's
taxes.
not a disgrace.
No, it's not. But if they did remove it and say that whatever your allowances are, you still have to pay 20% tax or something like that. I thought, in fact, a finance minister some
It used to
time
be
ago
there.
did try.
And
Yes.
then they
There was,
removed
yeah.
it.
Yeah. Would industry be disappointed with that, or does the bulk of industry pay taxes and feel that at least people should pay 20%?
I think the focus today in industry is, can we get more transparency into the tax laws? Can we get more simplicity? Which means, can we get the tax rate down and remove the exemptions? There are today 28 exemptions of different
28.
kinds. So there are 28 categories of people
Loopholes.
who are not paying tax in some form or the other, or get some
Or
concessions.
some use.
I think we need to look at that area, and we have proposed from CII that we should do away with exemptions and go for a lower corporate tax. And I think that is the solution, Prannoy, for everybody, and everybody
Simplify
would be
and just have one
satisfied. You
uniform
get
thing.
more revenue out of it, more
Coming
simplicity.
back to that, the subsidies point, actually, one of the biggest areas of concern for the finance minister will be how to control government spending. Over the last few years, this appears to have gone out of control. Total spending by the government is now approximately 200,000 crores a year. This roughly means that out of every 5 rupees spent in this country by everyone, 1 rupee is spent by the government. The finance minister's single biggest problem is the internal debt trap. The government today spends 60,000 crores on interest payments alone and about the same amount on debt repayments. Another major area of expenditure is defense, which accounts for 30,000 crores. And the government still hasn't been able to do anything about cutting down its own size. Salaries of central government employees is now an enormous 20,000 crores a year. And finally, the other main item of expenditure which we just discussed is subsidies, which instead of being cut back has now grown to around 15,000 crores or more. All this leaves little spare money for the government to spend on social services for the poor like health and education. So Rakesh, where is this money for the social services that you feel should be spent going to come from?
Well, one thing is that, and it's a risky making prediction just before the finance minister starts speaking in the Lok Sabha, that I think that the projections that were made in the interim budget for 96-97 revenues were short by about 10,000 crore. My prediction is that he will predict that this finance minister will predict another 5,000 crore both in income tax, another 5,000 crore from customs. So he, I think, does have about 10,000 crore more than Manmohan Singh had in the interim budget. And if he uses those well, that's one source. The other, I think this is much for the future, is that you really have to start paying off past debts so that the interest burden comes down.
That's coming down.
I think that given the pay commission coming up and so on, that it is not really practically feasible to be thinking of getting anything more from cutting down the government. I think that's the wrong way to go. That you really have to concentrate on paying back former debt, particularly from PSU disinvestment proceeds.
Public sector disinvestment, you sell off public sector units and retire some of your debt. Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen.